Major Jennings. What in the hell is this supposed to be, old-timer? The LED lights glinted off the cold steel surface. The conference room was silent, the kind of silence that made every breath sound too loud. An old man bowed his head over a worn-out coffee urn, his scarred hands moving with steady precision, each motion deliberate, almost ceremonial. Jennings, we've got an AK-9000 tactical barista right there. So why the hell are you using that museum piece? Silas didn't answer. His pale blue eyes calm, distant and cold as a winter sky shifted briefly toward the control panel. Silas, the calibrations officer. Water temp fluctuates 4 degrees. Makes the coffee bitter. Jennings laughed a short, derisive bark. Jennings. You think you know better than a $90,000 machine? Just stack the cups and disappear when the brass walks in. Silas gave a slight nod. No reaction. No defense. He simply wiped away a faint stain on the counter. The silver light from the ceiling caught on the edge of his old dented thermos resting beside the urn, polished smooth by years of use. Jennings. And get rid of that too. It looks unprofessional. A faint smile touched Silas's lips, the kind of weary smile worn by men who had once endured storms of gunfire, now facing only the arrogance of youth. The door closed behind Jennings. No one noticed what glimmered beneath the faded gray of Silas's uniform, a pale blue ribbon with 5 white stars quietly resting against his chest. A symbol, not yet recognized. CTA warm low tone, deliberate pacing. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have lived through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and join us in preserving the memory, the dignity, and the quiet honor of our silent heroes. Silas stood alone in the bright cold conference room. The light reflected off the reinforced glass, drawing long lines across his weathered face, a face carved by time where every wrinkle was a scar that had refused to fade. His faded gray uniform fluttered slightly in the hum of the air conditioner. Everything was so still that one could almost hear the slow, steady breathing of a man who had once survived the sound of gunfire and the haze of smoke. He raised a hand to straighten his collar. His fingers brushed against a small tear near the cuff. A single silver thread caught the light for an instant. Beneath the worn fabric lay a pale blue ribbon, hidden and still not kept for display, but as a quiet reminder that sometimes silence is the highest form of honor. A long breath escaped his chest. No complaint. No anger. Only the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and chosen peace over bitterness. Silas whispering, "Just make sure the coffee's right." His voice was so soft it barely reached his own ears, but inside those few words was the weight of a lifetime. Light flickered across his gray-blue eyes like a brief shimmer on water before the storm breaks. In that flicker, the past returned. The hum of the air conditioner vanished, replaced by the whirling thunder of Huey rotors slicing through the humid air. The smell of mudblood and gunpowder mixed in the heavy heat of a Shao Valley, 1968. Silas was young again. Tanned skin, mud-caked face, eyes burning with focus. He was dragging a wounded man through the sludge, a general chest soaked in blood, still trying to speak through broken breaths. "General Weekly, they'll never know, son, but God will." The man's trembling hand pressed a blue ribbon into Silas's palm. Rain poured down, merging with blood and tears, until the ground itself became a mirror of sacrifice. Then it was gone. The sound, the rain, the war. The room returned the hum of the vents, the cold, fluorescent light gleaming off polished steel. Silas stood, motionless, eyes still open but distant, staring at something only he could see, a battlefield half a century behind him. Slowly, he set his hand on the coffee urn, wiping each curve of the metal clean. Not out of affection for the job, but because it was the only way his hands, the same hands that once held a rifle, could still be useful in peacetime. A drop of water slid from the urn onto the table, breaking into tiny shards like fragments of memory he'd tried to suppress. In the far corner, the polished floor mirrored his reflection, a living portrait of time, one man standing between duty and remembrance. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps, slow, hesitant, young. The door creaked open. A faint gust slipped in, rustling a schedule sheet pinned to the wall. Airman Miller stepped inside, holding a tangle of signal cables. He froze for a second, watching the old man standing tall beside the coffee urn, posture calm and deliberate. There was no scent of gunpowder, no barked orders yet. Something in that stance stirred an instinct deep inside him. It was the posture of command, the kind seen in old black and white photos hanging in training halls. He said nothing, only watched. Silas looked up, his eyes kind and steady. He gave a small nod and gestured toward the cables. Silas softly. Careful with that connector, son. It's sensitive. Miller, yes, sir. The word slipped out before he realized what he'd said. Sir. He hesitated, embarrassed calling sir to a janitor. But Silas only smiled, not correcting, not offended. The light from the window stretched across their faces, one young, one old, one untouched by war, the other carrying it quietly within. Between them hung a moment of silence, small, fragile, but warmer than any word could be. Miller lowered his head and went back to work. But in his eyes, something had changed, to quiet respect for the man polishing the steel urn. And Silas, still wiping, moved with slow, deliberate precision, each motion like a breath drawn from the past, still alive in the present. Outside, wind whispered against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to rise, faint at first, then closer, urgent, inevitable, a signal that something long overdue was on its way. Jennings entered the room, his face carrying the smug satisfaction of a man who had just asserted his authority. He stopped at the end of the table, his voice cold and sharp steel tempered by arrogance. Jennings, when General Thompson arrives, you stay in that corner. Don't move. Don't speak. You're furniture. Got it? His tone cracked through the air like a final order, leaving no room for dignity to exist. Silas didn't respond right away. His eyes lowered. One hand tightened slightly against the edge of the table. A deep, slow breath. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost a whisper, Silas understood, sir. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. Heavier, sharper, as if something unseen had just fractured in the air. When Silas bent down to pick up the cleaning cloth, the hem of his gray work shirt slipped slightly. The light caught something beneath it, a pale blue ribbon with 5 white stars. Jennings saw it. His brow furrowed, then his lips curled into a cruel smirk, a grin that cut across his face like a scar. Jennings, what's this Pop's pie-eating contest? He stepped closer, not waiting for an answer. The metal ring on his finger brushed against the ribbon. A harmless gesture, but in that instant, Silas's world collapsed into the sound of helicopter blades and fire. The whoomp-whoomp of Huey rotors filled the air. Wind tore through scorched bamboo. The smell of mud, blood, and smoke fused into one choking breath. Silas, only 22 then, was on his knees in the mud, dragging a badly wounded man through brown, rain-soaked sludge. A general. The man's face was ashen breath coming in ragged bursts, blood bubbling at his lips. Voice faint, trembling, they can never know it was you, but God will. The general's hand closed around Silas's, pressing into it a blood-soaked blue ribbon. Thunder cracked overhead. The Huey's blades carved through the gray sky as rain poured down, mixing with sweat, with blood, with tears. Then the memory broke. The storm vanished. The conference room returned, white lights, sterile air, polished metal. Silas froze, his hand trembling just enough for anyone nearby to notice. He covered the ribbon, shielding it like a wound that had never fully healed. The harsh light from above cast across his face, highlighting the deep lines around his mouth, the place where smiles had long ceased to live. His blue-gray eyes lowered again, not angry, just heavy, worn by a soul that had seen too much and spoken too little. Jennings stared, seeing nothing beyond the old man's irritating calm. Jennings, impatient. I said, stay in the corner. Don't touch anything else. No reply. No defiance. Silas simply nodded, a motion so slight it could have been mistaken for a bow. No one else in the room spoke. But from the far side, Airman Miller had seen everything. He stared at the old man, at the trembling hand pressed against his chest. Miller's eyes shifted from curiosity to realization, to quiet rage. He didn't yet know what that ribbon meant, but instinct told him it wasn't decoration. He turned away, swallowing the anger that burned in his throat. In his mind, a single question began to echo, who the hell is he? Across the room, Silas stood still, his back slightly bent, yet unyielding. The clock ticked on steady and cold, marking the rhythm of memories the old man was trying to bury. Miller clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on the faint outline of that blue ribbon now hidden once more beneath the worn gray fabric. He knew there was something monumental about this man, something Major Jennings would never begin to understand. The fluorescent lights flickered once. A whisper of wind slipped through the doorframe, carrying with it the faint scent of rust and warm coffee. No one spoke, but everything in that room had already changed. In the corner, Miller bent down to pick up his phone, eyes drifting toward the long hallway outside. An idea had just sparked in his mind, reckless but necessary. Miller stepped back, his chest rising and falling hard. His heartbeat pounded like a marching drum inside his ribs. The scene he had just witnessed, Jennings's condescending touch and that fleeting pained look in the old veteran's eyes, made it impossible for him to stand still any longer. His hand trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket. The bluish glow of the screen lit up his tense face. His fingers flew over the keys. Each word typed felt like firing a round into the dark. Light blue ribbons of 5 white stars. The screen blinked. Then the first line appeared. Medal of Honor. Miller froze. A chill ran down his spine as if someone had poured ice water straight into his heart. He swallowed hard. His pulse was so loud he could hear it in his ears. His breath came uneven and sharp. Slowly, he looked back toward the old man, standing quietly beside the coffee urn, the overhead light reflecting off his scarred, time-worn face gleaming like an old medal that refused to fade. He knew then silence was no longer an option. Scrolling through his contacts, he found the name Colonel Matthews' aide to General Marcus Thompson. He hesitated for 1 second, then pressed the call button. Miller whispering, "Sir, this is Airman Miller at Creech. You need to get General Thompson here now. It's a matter of honor." The line went dead quiet. Only his heartbeat filled the silence, fast, uneven, urgent. Then the colonel's low, steady voice came through, edged with skepticism. "Colonel," over the phone, "stay put." "Airman." The call ended. A small, metallic click, cold, final, echoing like a shell casing, hitting the floor. Miller gripped the phone tighter. Fear and conviction churned together in his chest, the uneasy mix of a man who had just risked his career, but maybe, just maybe, saved someone's honor. He glanced toward Silas. The old man still hadn't moved. His shoulders trembled slightly, one hand resting on the steel urn. Each motion, small, precise, restrained, looked like an effort to keep himself from fading away inside that airless room full of invisible shame. Jennings, meanwhile, stood at the center, his voice booming in self-importance. "Jennings. Gentlemen, this program will redefine aerial command precision. That's what separates modern officers from the relics of the past." Miller bit his lip so hard he tasted iron. Relics of the past. That's what he called men like Silas, the ones who had built the very ground he stood on. Sweat slicked Miller's palms. His mouth was dry. No one else spoke. The 2 junior officers near the screen avoided eye contact, frozen by fear of being noticed. Only Miller stood still at the back of the room, his gaze locked on the old veteran. Silas didn't react. He didn't speak. He didn't even look up. He just kept polishing the coffee urn, slow, deliberate, careful, and with every stroke of his hand against the metal, you could almost feel the quiet tension running beneath his weathered skin. Time crawled heavy and suffocating. The second hand of the clock moved tick, 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 each beat stretching longer than the last. 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Then somewhere outside, the distant wail of a siren began to rise. Jennings stopped mid-sentence, irritation creasing his brow. "Jennings, what's that noise? There's no DV arrival scheduled for another hour." No one answered. But Miller knew. His heart pounded faster. He looked down at his phone, then toward the door. The hallway light flickered faint but steady, like the reflection of headlights from a convoy drawing near. Silas remained motionless, unaware. He didn't know that justice was already on its way, quiet, precise, unstoppable. Miller drew a deep breath, forcing down the tremor in his chest. He stood tall, eyes fixed on the door ahead. Inside him, a single thought whispered a vow no one else could hear. It's time someone remembered who he really is. Outside, the siren stretched into a rising chorus, sharp, commanding. Tires screeched against concrete. The red and blue reflections danced on the walls like the heartbeat of something long dormant finally waking. The silence that had ruled the room for so long was about to break. The sirens wailed on the sound, echoing against the concrete walls of Creech Air Force Base. Everyone in the briefing room froze, eyes darting to one another in confusion. Jennings turned sharply, his voice slicing through the air, cold and sharp as a blade. "Jennings, what's going on?" No one answered. Only the faint whistle of wind slipped through the doorframe, stirring a thin layer of dust that shimmered in the white fluorescent light. A young officer near the screen stiffened when he saw the hallway lights flicker red and blue, strobes flashing in rhythm like the quickened heartbeat of the base itself. Then bang, the conference room doors burst open. Light poured in, cold and harsh, flooding over a row of uniforms standing frozen in place. Boots struck the floor in unison, Deliberate, heavy, the rhythm of someone who had marched through 1,000 parades and 100 funerals. General Marcus Thompson stepped into the room. His shadow filled the space before his voice did. On his shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars, reflecting the ceiling lights, like metal that had tasted real battle. 2 colonels followed close behind, faces, hard eyes, cold. No one spoke. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to stop so thick that the faint pounding of hearts could almost be heard. Jennings stiffened, hastily adjusting his uniform. His lips parted, trying to form words, but his throat had gone dry. He didn't understand. None of it made sense. Thompson, however, said nothing. His gaze moved slowly, methodically, sweeping across the room, the glass table, the tactical screens, the neat rows of chairs, and the faces frozen in dread. Then his eyes stopped. They landed on the old man standing by the coffee urn. The moment stretched only a few seconds, but long enough for the entire room to feel suspended in time. Silas stood exactly as before, in his faded gray maintenance uniform, a rag in one hand. The overhead light caught his weathered face, calm, unreadable, carved with the quiet dignity of endurance. No one understood why, but at that instant, something in General Thompson's face changed. The steel melted from his expression, replaced by something deep, startled, and profoundly reverent. His eyes softened, shimmering with an emotion that decades of command could not suppress. He moved forward. Each step was slow, heavy, deliberate. The sound of his boots striking the tile reverberated through the silence, steady, echoing like a drum of respect. When he reached Silas, the general halted. He straightened to full height, drew a breath, and raised his hand in salute. It was a perfect salute, sharp, clean, executed with absolute precision. But it wasn't the technique that froze the room. It was the meaning. A 4-star general, a man who had advised presidents, commanded fleets, and held the authority to move nations, now stood rigid, saluting a janitor. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. Jennings stood motionless, color draining from his face, eyes darting wildly, as if trying to deny the truth unraveling before him. General Thompson kept his hand raised, his voice low but resonant, deep and trembling with reverence. Thompson. Sir, it's an honor to see you again. The word sir fell into the room like a strike of metal against the heart. No one understood yet, but everyone felt it. Something sacred was happening. Silas lifted his head slightly. The light reflected in his pale blue eyes, calm, steady, unshaken. There was no pride there, no surprise, only a quiet sadness resting deep within. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, slow, weary, humble. And that nod, that small human gesture, shifted the entire axis of power in the room. Jennings's head dropped. His mouth quivered, but no sound came out. The 2 young officers beside him lowered their gaze to the floor, right hands rising instinctively to their chests, an unspoken salute of respect. At the back, Airman Miller felt his eyes sting. He understood now this wasn't ceremony. It was history itself standing in front of them, in the form of an old man holding a battered coffee thermos. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Everything was sealed within that single moment, a salute, and the absolute recognition owed to a man who had once carried the honor of a nation in silence. The air still vibrated with it, fragile and powerful all at once. But beneath the reverence, something else was stirring, the truth still hidden, but beginning to surface. Thompson lowered his hand, his eyes shifting slowly from Silas to the trembling major at the end of the table. He tilted his head slightly, voice lowering, the calm giving way to a gathering storm. The general was about to speak, and when he did, the entire room would learn who Silas Croft truly was. General Thompson turned his eyes sweeping across the entire room. His voice cut through the silence, deep, cold, rhythmic, like a command delivered on the battlefield. Thompson, you have no idea who you were just speaking to. The words weren't loud, but they sliced the air in 2. Jennings froze. His lips trembled. His voice broke. Jennings. Sir, he's... Janitorial staff General Thompson advanced toward him, slow but heavy, each step landing like a hammer. The overhead light caught the 4 silver stars on his collar shawl, gleaming like symbols of justice burning into life. He stopped at the center of the room, turned to face Jennings directly. His voice dropped lower, but burned with fire. Thompson. This man is Master Chief Petty Officer Silas Croft, United States Navy, founding member of SEAL Team 6. The room went still. A young lieutenant dropped his pen, the tiny clatter echoing through the suffocating quiet. Every head turned toward the old man standing by the coffee urn. Silas remained motionless. His scarred hand rested on the table, the light tracing the rough lines of skin etched by a lifetime of war. He showed no pride, only the humility of someone who had carried burdens too heavy for the world to understand. Thompson turned to the rest of the officers, his gaze sharp with authority. Thompson continuing. He led missions so classified, the report said only. He paused, then enunciated every word like a carved inscription, objective achieved by unforeseen circumstances. Each syllable struck the walls like the clang of steel. No one dared breathe. The air was thick enough to feel. The general raised a hand toward the faded blue ribbon pinned inside Silas's jacket, his voice trembling, but steady. Thompson. He earned 3 medals of honor. 2 of them are secret. This one, his eyes softened, shimmering with emotion, his public record. Ashau Valley, 1968. A beat of silence. Then his tone shifted reverent, like a priest recounting a sacred story. Thompson. He saved an entire battalion, held the line for 72 hours, 17 wounds, 2 captures, 2 escapes, and the last man he carried out was my father. All the light in the room seemed to fall upon 2 figures, a 4-star general and an old man in a faded work uniform. Each word from Thompson landed heavy like metal hitting earth. Jennings could no longer stand. He stumbled back, his legs hitting the chair, collapsing into it, as his hands gripped the table for balance. Sweat rolled down his forehead. His eyes went blank with disbelief. Before him no longer stood a janitor, but a living legend the man whispered about, across generations of soldiers known only by one name, the Whisperer. The others in the room were motionless. A young lieutenant placed his hand over his heart, eyes glistening. No one gave an order, but every soldier in the room instinctively stood at attention. Respect required no command. Silas remained silent. He didn't look up. His fingers brushed absently across a scratch on the table's surface. In the midst of all this reverence, he saw only faces, the ones left behind in the mud and smoke of forgotten wars. The white light from the ceiling reflected off the polished coffee urn. On its surface, the reflection of 2 generations of warriors overlapped, one old, one young, bound by the same code of silence and honor. General Thompson inhaled deeply. His voice dropped low, almost a whisper to himself. Thompson. We walk among legends, and we don't even know it. No one answered. The only sounds were the faint hiss of air from the vents and the steady heartbeat of men who had just realized they were standing before living history. Jennings bowed his head, his body trembling, every ounce of arrogance drained away. Thompson watched him for a long moment, then slowly turned back to Silas. His tone softened, but it was still the voice of command, the voice of reverence. Thompson, you should have been saluted the moment you walked in. Silas finally lifted his head. His blue-gray eyes shimmered with both weariness and compassion. He said nothing, only a slow, humble nod, and in that single nod lived all the forgiveness of a man who had seen too many of humanity's failures to hate any longer. The air in the room hung thick with awe. The revelation had reshaped every soul present, but General Thompson's voice rose again, steady, resonant, carrying a different weight now. It was no longer the tone of reprimand. It was the beginning of a story no one in that room had ever heard, a story that would make them understand why the name Silas Croft would never be forgotten. General Thompson stepped slowly to the center of the room and stood still for a few seconds. He removed his cap and placed it gently on the table. His eyes glistened with restrained emotion, but his voice carried the steady cadence of a man who had once commanded through the roar of battle. Thompson. He was 22, holding off an army for 72 hours, 17 wounds, 2 captures, 2 escapes. The room was utterly still. Each number that left the general's lips sounded like a slow funeral drumbeat echoing in the space between every breath. He turned his gaze toward Jennings, the once proud officer, now trembling, stripped bare of every illusion of rank and control. Thompson. He didn't serve coffee, Major. He served this nation. The final word struck the air sharp and metallic, like steel drawn across stone. Jennings collapsed to his knees, one hand braced on the floor, the other trembling uncontrollably. All the arrogance that had once laced his voice was gone, crushed under the weight of shame. He tried to speak, but no words came, only the shallow, uneven gasps of a man who had just realized how small he truly was. Jennings weakly. Sir, I didn't know. General Thompson tilted his head, the edge of anger gone. What remained was sorrow and disappointment. Thompson. That's the problem, Major. None of you knew. You see the uniform, but not the man inside it. He turned away, scanning the room, a room now heavy with remorse. The sound of breathing filled the silence, each exhale carrying the weight of guilt and awe. Two young officers straightened their posture, eyes shining with emotion. At the far wall, Airman Miller, the youngest in the room, stood with his fists clenched, eyes wet with restrained pride. Miller quietly, I'm honored to have served in the same room with him. The words were soft, but they pierced straight through the room, not a statement, but a confession on behalf of an entire generation. Thompson looked at him, his expression softening. He nodded once, his voice deep and measured. Thompson. Son, today you did what most men forget, you stood for honor. Then he turned toward Silas, walking slowly, respectfully. Each step he took seemed to count the passing of years, the 57 years since Ashow Valley, 1968. Silas stood motionless, slightly leaning the fabric on his shoulders, faded and worn thin. The sunlight filtered through the glass window, landing on the blue-silver ribbon resting against his chest, making it glow softly, not like a medal, but like a prayer. Thompson stopped before him, his voice catching slightly barely above a whisper. Thompson. My father never forgot your name. Neither should this nation. Silas lowered his head. He didn't answer. He simply drew a deep breath, his eyes closing, a faint sorrow flickering across his face, the kind only a survivor can understand. Silas, we all did what we had to do, General. Nothing more. Thompson said nothing in return. Instead, he raised his hand, saluting for the second time slowly, reverently, as if performing a farewell. This time, no one in the room remained still. Every officer, every airman, every witness lifted their hand to their forehead, an unspoken salute that carried the weight of an entire nation's gratitude. The light softened, streaming through the glass, and casting the shadows of Silas and the coffee urn onto the wall, two shapes, small yet eternal symbols of service and sacrifice. No one saw it, but at the corner of Silas's eye, a single tear fell. Not a tear of pride, but of memory, and for the souls that had been left behind in the rain of 1968. He turned away gently, adjusting the urn on the table, wiping it once more, as if offering one final wordless thank you to the past. No one dared break the moment. As he walked slowly back toward the corner of the room, everyone remained frozen in place because silence itself had become the highest form of respect. General Thompson's eyes followed him, his hands clenched tightly at his sides as though fighting to say something. But before he could, Silas turned back, his voice rough and low, no longer that of a soldier, but of a teacher. Silas turned around slowly, the light catching his weathered face, every wrinkle etched with the years of war that had shaped him. His voice came low and steady, carrying no trace of anger, only the calm of a man long past the need for it. Silas. He's just a boy, Marcus. Full of pride, like we all were once. The words were soft as a breath, yet they landed heavy like a confession. General Thompson stood tall, his head bowed slightly. His eyes drifted somewhere far behind the walls of that room, back to his own youth, when he too had worn pride like armor and mistook rank for wisdom. Silas moved toward the table, each step slow, deliberate, weighted with years, but firm with purpose. The light caught the edge of his silvered metal, its worn surface glinting a dim, steady light, fragile but unwavering. Silas, uniforms and rank make a man forget that respect is earned, not demanded. He stopped beside the old thermos, his thin hands unscrewing the lid. Warm coffee steam rose soft and sweet, curling into the thick air of the room. The scent mingled with the pale afternoon light, seeping through the window, turning the cold conference room strangely peaceful, almost sacred. Every eye fixed on him. No one dared to move to speak, even to breathe too loud. Even Jennings, once the loudest man in the room, now knelt head bowed, listening in silence. Silas poured coffee into a white ceramic cup. The steam blurred half his face. When he spoke again, his voice was rough but warm in a way that only years and loss can shape. Silas. The lesson is more important than the punishment. He looked around at the young faces frozen in shame at the shoulders of the old general, trembling beneath the weight of memory. His tone remained calm, every word clear and deliberate, as though carving truth into the very air. Silas. Break a man, he gets bitter. Teach him humility. You might save an officer. No hum of fans. No footsteps. No rustling paper. Only the faint rhythmic sound of coffee dripping into the cup, each drop round heavy, resonant. No one spoke. No one met his eyes. Miller stood silently, hands clenched, his eyes bright, as if witnessing a ritual he would carry with him forever. And General Thompson, a man who had once commanded tens of thousands, who had stood before presidents, without trembling, now simply nodded, his voice shaking. Thompson. Yes, sir. Two simple words, not of rank, but of recognition. A thank you from one soldier to another, across decades, and across the distance between power and humility. Silas said nothing more. He lifted the cup of coffee and held it out to the general, a gesture so small yet somehow more solemn than any military ceremony. Silas, it's still hot. The old general accepted it with both hands, bowing his head slightly. His throat tightened. No words followed. The room fell into silence again, but this silence was different. It was not heavy with fear or guilt. It was filled with awakening gratitude and the quiet return of honor long forgotten. Jennings remained kneeling, vision-blurred lips trembling as if to form an apology. Silas placed a hand on his shoulder light, as air firm as truth. Silas, learn from it. That's all that matters. The words were brief, but they rescued something inside the young officer's soul. That hand, scarred, steady, forgiving, did not judge. It redeemed. Thompson bowed his head in silence. Miller raised his hand in salute, not from duty, but instinct, the kind of instinct born from witnessing grace. In that moment, every man in the room understood courage isn't only found on the battlefield. Sometimes it lives in forgiveness, in the mercy of those who have every right to condemn but choose to teach instead. The warmth of the coffee mingled with the faint scent of steel and dust fading into the amber light of the setting sun. Silas returned to his chair, setting the thermos down and sitting quietly, as though nothing remarkable had happened, just another day's work done. But everyone there knew better. No one in that room would ever be the same again. Outside the window, the light dimmed, leaving only a golden streak glinting off the blue-silver ribbon on Silas's chest. And when the bass loudspeaker sounded the end-of-shift call, they all understood. A legacy isn't forged in metals, it lives on in those who choose silence so others may learn to live with honor. The next morning, Creech Air Force Base was unusually quiet. The first light of dawn slanted through the tall glass panels, casting long beams down the main corridor, where polished steel walls mirrored every step that passed. The faint scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air, mingling with the familiar aroma of coffee drifting from the old conference room. At the center of the hallway, a small brass plaque had been mounted on the wall. No ceremony, no music, no honor guard. Only a few young airmen who stopped as they walked by, removing their caps and bowing their heads. On the polished metal surface, delicate engraving caught the Nevada morning light, glinting gold. In honor of Master Chief Silas Croft, the quiet valor. No flowers, no frame. Just a simple plaque, as humble as the man it honored. General Thompson passed by and paused for a moment. He reached out, resting his hand on the engraved words, his fingers trembling faintly. His breath came slow, reverent, as if speaking to someone long gone, though Silas Croft was still alive somewhere out there, perhaps in a small house on the edge of town, or sitting quietly in the fading light of some roadside cafe. At the far end of the hall stood Airman Miller, leaning against the wall cap held at his side. He was no longer the uncertain young airman from that day. A new stripe now marked his shoulder, but every time he passed the plaque, he still stopped. He reached out and placed his palm against the cool brass surface, feeling the engraved letters beneath his fingers. Miller softly. A matter of honor, always. His voice was barely audible, but it carried the sincerity of a promise. His eyes drifted down the hall, where the light fell at an angle across the wall, casting the faint outline of an old man holding a silver thermos, as if his spirit still lingered in the reflection. And Major Jennings, once proud and blind, no longer walked those polished corridors. He had been reassigned to logistics, a quiet department, where the work was to process old war files, faded reports, and missions few remembered. Day after day, he opened sealed folders stamped classified. Sometimes he paused, staring at a name that appeared again and again: S. Croft, Operation Eagle Claw, status complete. No one needed to explain it to him. He understood now, honor isn't something you claim. It's something you learn one day at a time. Back in the old conference room where everything had begun, the steel coffee urn still stood in its place. No one dared replace it. No one dared throw it away. They simply wiped off the dust each morning, and sometimes, when the light hit it just right, it gleamed like a metal that had never stopped shining. On the lid of the silver thermos, a new line had been engraved, no one knew by whom. The letters were small and sharp, and when sunlight passed over them, they seemed to glow. Respect is earned, not demanded. That sentence became the unofficial creed of Creech Air Force Base. Young officers memorized it as if it were an oath, one carved deeper in the heart than any regulation ever could. Sometimes at sunset, people would see General Thompson stop outside that same room. He would quietly pour himself a cup of coffee from the old urn and sit for a few minutes, not in mourning, but in remembrance, to remind himself that the greatest kind of courage isn't found in victory, but in humility when recognition no longer matters. One morning, Miller stood before the plaque again. A light breeze stirred the hallway, rustling the base flag hanging nearby. He straightened, lifted his hand in salute, his palm resting against his chest. In the sunlight, the words, "The quiet valor," glowed gold, then faded softly into the rising day. From somewhere down the hall, the bass loudspeaker began to play "The Morning Colors," an old tune, solemn and low, yet filled with pride. Narration. Calm, steady, closing tone. True courage doesn't need a battlefield, only a heart that remembers. The final image lingered on the old coffee urn, reflecting the clear blue sky outside the window. The engraved words on its lid shone once more, then slowly faded as the screen dimmed to black. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes,